Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Julie Kennedy. I am one of the faculty directors, along with my colleague all the way in the back, Professor Larry Diamond, of the Haas Center for Public Service. On behalf of the whole center, we welcome you to today's lecture, the Mimi and Peter E. Haas Distinguished Visitor Lecture. In addition to our distinguished visitor here with us for the next 2 months, Dr. Gro Brundtland, we have also today to introduce Dr. Brundtland, our Provost John Etchemendy. John, so it is my job to introduce John, who then gets to introduce to you Gro. John is now the longest serving provost at Stanford. He has been provost, extraordinary amount of service, speaking of public service, since 2000. He has been a faculty member in the philosophy department since 1983. He is also on the faculty in the Symbolic Systems program, and one I'm embarrassed to admit I had not heard of before, the Center for Study of Language and Information. And so you are spread around campus quite a bit. As a professor, John has received numerous teaching awards. He won the Dean's Award for Excellence in Teaching, the Bing Award for Excellence in Teaching, and one much more specific to his area of expertise in logic, the EduCom Medal for Leadership in the Application of Technology to the Teaching of Logic. As provost, he's been particularly instrumental in moving forward and creating a program called Be Well, also with a connection to the health work of our distinguished visitor, that is a program to keep all of us active and fit and in much better shape than we might be otherwise, turning into a model that others can use around the nation. And finally, John has just been an amazing champion for the work that we do at the center, and indeed in helping us to create this very position, to conceive of the position and move it forward, for which we are enormously grateful. And it is through the kinds of talks that we get to have and discussions that will come from today's talk, that Stanford shows one more example of leadership in moving forward and advancing solutions to global challenges. So please join me in welcoming our provost, John Etchemendy.
So thank you, Julie, for that introduction. I hate it when people introduce me, but that's okay. Not you, Julie. I mean, I think. So I want to thank everybody for joining us here today for the Haas Distinguished Visitor Lectures on public service and citizenship. I'm really deeply honored to have the privilege of introducing Dr. Gro Brundtland, our speaker today, and the Mimi and Peter Haas Distinguished Visitor for the year. Before I do that, however, I want to acknowledge Mimi Haas, who is here, I think in the back, who is with us. Stanford is thankful to the Haas family for making the Distinguished Visitor Program possible, but really thankful to the Haas family for so much more and so much that they've done in support of public service and the public service aspirations of Stanford students and faculty. So I want to thank Mimi on behalf of the university. We're very grateful for their vision and generosity in supporting this and in supporting many, many other things. So Dr. Gro Brundtland is the former Prime Minister of Norway, as I'm sure that all of you know. She's former Director General of the World Health Organization, a UN Special Envoy on Climate Change, and Deputy Chair of the Elders, which is a group of leaders that are committed to tackling the world's toughest challenges. Thank you, Dr. Brundtland, for spending some time here on the farm. We're delighted to have you here. Dr. Brundtland, I think, is really an inspired choice for this visitorship. Throughout her career as a doctor, public health physician, policymaker, and international leader, she's personified public service. She is an extraordinary role model for our students, and they will have a chance to make her acquaintance through not just this lecture, but through meetings and seminars that will be held. From her, they can learn much more about leadership and about promoting global health, gender equity, sustainable development, and worldwide peace and prosperity. As most of you know, I think, Dr. Brundtland was the first woman and the youngest person to serve as Norway's Prime Minister. She was head of government in Norway for more than 10 years, serving as Prime Minister 3 times. Significantly, she was prime minister when that country hosted the 1993 Israeli-Palestinian peace talks, resulting in the signing of the Oslo Accords. In 1983, the then United Nations Secretary General invited her to establish and chair the World Commission on Environment and Development, now widely known appropriately as the Brundtland Commission. The group introduced the concept of sustainable development and published the report Our Common Future in 1987, which led to the first Earth Summit. As Director General of the World Health Organization from 1998 to 2003, Dr. Brundtland is credited with, among other things, drawing attention to poverty as a health threat, summoning resources to counter the dangers of cigarette smoking and tobacco use, and leading responses to such global epidemics as AIDS and SARS. As I mentioned, Dr. Brundtland is currently the deputy chair of the Elders, a group of world leaders that was originally convened by the late Nelson Mandela and others to tackle the world's toughest issues. Chaired by Kofi Annan, the group also includes such renowned international figures as Ila Boot, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, Jimmy Carter, Graça Michel, Mary Robinson, and Archbishop Desmond Tutu. As a member of the Elders, she's traveled widely in support of peace, global health, gender equality, and sustainable development. For instance, she has joined delegations to Israel and the West Bank. She traveled in 2012 to Cairo to support the democratic efforts in Egypt. She's visited Greece, Turkey, and Cyprus to encourage reconciliation between Greek Cypriot and Turkish Cypriot communities. And in April 2011, she joined an elders delegation to the Korean Peninsula and China in an effort to improve relations between North and South Korea. As all of you know, Stanford is committed to inspiring its students to give back, to contribute, and to lead. In their founding grant, Jane and Leland Stanford said that they wanted their university to, quote, promote the public welfare by exercising an influence on behalf of humanity and civilization, teaching the blessings of liberty regulated by law, and inculcating love and reverence for the great principles of government. I can honestly think of no better role model to help our students learn how to do that than Dr. Gro Brundtland. And so please help me in giving her a warm Stanford welcome.
Thank you so much, Provost and Julie. Ladies and gentlemen, can you hear me well? Because I was not always happy about the way it worked, when I was listening. So, you're okay. Well, I happened to be giving a keynote speech at the Oslo Energy Forum a year ago when I met another key speaker, Sally Benson, the director of your Global Climate and Energy Project, at this now well-known and highly respected yearly event in my country, Norway. A few months later, I was invited to give a speech at their research symposium that was held in October last year. A full day ahead, my husband and I met with faculty and students from a broad field here at Stanford. And I was also given an invitation to come back as visitor for a longer period this spring, which is what starts now. Strangely, I thought when invited to speak last year, within all the travel and activities I have been involved in during my long life, it had still not brought me to this famous university and its many faceted and inspiring surroundings. Now, my life has been dominated by a series of daunting challenges. It has also been a continuous journey of learning, seeking evidence, and inspiring change and innovation, based on a commitment to promoting justice, equal rights, and opportunities for all. Born in a small, equitable, democratic, and increasingly prosperous country, I was one of the lucky ones in this world. I had parents with deep convictions and was raised to believe in a society based on shared values and solidarity. I became a doctor, a public health specialist, a wife, and a mother of 4. Then a politician, a responsibility that dominated my life for the next 25 years, nationally and internationally, until, interestingly, I combined my original profession and leadership experience in becoming the first woman to lead the World Health Organization. Today, 10 years after I left WHO, I am, as you heard, an elder, serving with a group of experienced and independent leaders to promote peace and human rights, seeking to overcome conflict and contribute to solutions to seemingly intractable problems. Now, half a century ago, if we go back in history to the mid-60s, I returned from a postgraduate year at Harvard, a young doctor of only 25. My medical degree had been from Oslo. Now I had become Master of Public Health, ready to enter public service. This was, imagine, 4 years before oil was first found on the Norwegian continental shelf. It was old times, old history. I think it's a dramatic illustration of major change. Norway has, in the following decades, grown into a position of one of the largest oil and gas producers in the world. Now, this is why Sally Benson and I were both speaking at the Oslo Energy Forum, held in a country where no one had anticipated, only 50 years ago, that there were such enormous resources under the continental shelf in the North Sea. In its very last attempt, after a series of unsuccessful search drillings, Phillips Petroleum found what became the Ekofisk field in 1969, starting Norway's rise as a major oil nation. Now you can ask, how could it come about that the young doctor and Harvard graduate ended up as a Stanford speaker on energy and sustainable development? As I chose to become a doctor, my perspective was to make a difference in helping pursue health and human rights, a fair and just society, not least for women. It was clear to me as a young girl that girls were discriminated against in school as well as in family and working life, even in Norway, a socially well-advanced and democratic country. This was wrong and unfair. I felt a strong urge to try to make a difference. My specialty was chosen accordingly. This was not about which clinical specialty I would pursue. My focus was on public health. At Harvard, I met the international arena. My colleagues were doctors, often with 10 and 15 years of experience already, from all continents. I was the youngest in my class and could benefit from experiences and cultures from across the world. I was curious about the roles of women in different societies and circumstances. My main paper was on breastfeeding, cultures, practices, and trends across the world, as I majored in maternal and child health. Promoting breastfeeding became one of many issues that I was pushing for as I returned to Oslo and started my work at the Directorate of Health. In 1981, many years later, as Prime Minister, I had a chance to actively support the resolution that was being prepared by the WHO to regulate the marketing of milk substitutes, now increasingly undermining the best, the healthiest, and the safest food for infants. One of many examples of how long-term commitments really can make a difference. Not many prime ministers, were involved in supporting something happening in the WHO. I did. The continuous focus on the importance of breastfeeding ever since the 60s has led Norway to be in the lead in international statistics on the prevalence of breastfeeding. These efforts, however, were not an isolated issue. It was part of a much broader drive towards women's rights and opportunities in society and in working life. I was fully aware that the rights of women to be both mothers and breadwinners required deliberate changes in society. By the time I stepped down as a prime minister in 1996, parental leave with 80% pay had already reached 1 year. And the rule that fathers only could take out the last 4 weeks had been introduced, already by me, but when I left, then in the next 10, 15 years, the Labour governments have increased it further to 14 weeks. So when they stepped down last fall, this important rule was 14 weeks, meaning that employers no longer could think only of women as potential risks for leaves of absence. But then you can ask, how did all of this happen? As I was asked to enter government 9 years after my 1 year at Harvard, I quickly realized that I could now expand my professional and activist activities and have a much greater influence in promoting many necessary changes in my society, in our policies. But then you can say, why? How could that happen? The doctor and the public health person. Well, was it just by chance? Well, partly yes. I would say that the Prime Minister took a real chance in picking me out in the first place. And frankly, we do need more such people, men as well as women, who are ready to take risks and show some courage. When the young doctor, to everybody's surprise, was appointed Minister of the Environment in 1974, I myself was equally surprised. I had been working in public health on women's issues, including family planning, but had no ambition in the direction of becoming a politician. Although I did come from a political family background. It seemed even more challenging when the Prime Minister asked me not to take over the Ministry of Health, but the Ministry of Environment. When considering how to respond to such a great challenge, given my lack of political experience, I asked myself only one fundamental question. How could I even contemplate giving a negative response based on my own beliefs and convictions that women should take parallel responsibilities with men in a society with equal rights for women as for men. The only second thought, of course, was my family and my husband, and I did ask them. There is no doubt that, there's another different question that people were asking. How could it happen that a young professional like me, who had not worked for years within the party and who had never run for political office, was selected? There's no doubt that one reason for this radical choice was the growing awareness, also within the Labour Party and the labor union movement, that it no longer would be acceptable to continue having such a gross imbalance in our decision-making bodies. At this time, only 10% of our parliamentarians were women. We were 3 women in a 19-member government. So clearly, it was time for change. Luckily, it did turn out that the Prime Minister's choice was seen as a success story as time passed and I was being tested. Already 8 months later, I was elected the first woman deputy leader of my party. It, of course, greatly increased my possibilities to influence policies and take initiatives. I had seen early on that my role as Environment Minister could benefit from my own medical background and public health training. After all, our biggest concern for the environment is about the health of people, although we need to realize how dependent we all have become on the health of our planet. My personal background, my public health training, my international perspective earned at Harvard all helped, and so did my 9 years of public service. I had been developing programs and policies in school health, in family planning, nationally and later in our capital, Oslo. As it turned out, I was unafraid. I felt confident about the ethics and evidence I always chose to base my arguments and my decisions upon. I spoke my mind, I traveled the country, and represented Norway internationally without fear. This was also a platform from which to insist, even this international, to insist on evidence and on research-based decisions. It helped build this attitude, helped build credibility and confidence within my party, across political parties, and across countries. That's how it turned out. And I thank Harvard, partly for these attitudes. The key links between health and environment, health and development had become central in my own thinking already at Harvard, but they were certainly further amplified and proven as I entered into political responsibility 9 years later. I was aware I needed to spread my attention widely. Across the portfolios of most of my cabinet colleagues: finance, industry, energy, transport, health, education, as well as urban and rural planning. My colleagues were all in charge of policies that had effects upon the environment, and I made them know. It was highly relevant to analyze and to pursue the changes needed in all government policies to promote a healthier environment. These policies, as much as Norway's petroleum sector, has changed living conditions and opportunities for women. Now I'm talking broadly about what I'm telling about the changes we had to make. There is today no doubt that the prosperity and standard of living in Norway is even more the result of our active policies to inspire women's roles in all parts of society, as it is to the oil sector. In analyzing a quite exceptional chain of events in my life, the next question is, how did it come that this still young woman, deputy leader, became prime minister in a crowded field of experienced and ambitious men? It happened less than 6 years later. As I was appointed prime minister at 41, the youngest ever in Norway, there were many of the men who had supported me to be deputy leader who were absolutely not ready to see the woman become the leader. Many of them were taken by surprise when public opinion, within and outside my party, pointed to such a radical change. How had that happened? There is no simple answer, obviously, but a number of factors did play a role. How people by now had much greater possibility to follow events directly. Through the TV and news, they saw their leaders in different situations, also at critical moments. They had more of a chance to form their personal impression. The myth that women were not equally ready and able and capable as men to serve in high government positions was gradually broken down during those years, as people could observe their politicians more directly. Environmental issues also were of increasing concern to my people over these years. I passed tough new legislation and programs to prevent water and air pollution and pushed internationally for action against acid rain and transboundary air and water pollution. Many people supported my active approach. A critical test came, however, when I stood in the limelight of the international press. They had never come to Norway in such numbers any time before. It was 1977 when Norway was hit by a major blowout from an oil platform called Bravo in the Phillips Petroleum Ekofisk field. My ministry had just passed new legislation to give the government full authority to deal with such a situation and to give the company necessary instructions about the control measures they were obliged to take. This gave me credibility in my response to Parliament as a storm of criticism of the government was voiced in public. Again, I think, my background, my consistent belief in evidence, my years in the US with my parents as a young child in 5th grade, which I haven't even mentioned yet, and my year at Harvard, helped immensely in this dramatic and challenging situation. I could directly respond to hundreds of journalists who threw difficult, not only political, but also technical questions to me, chosen to be the main minister in charge during the crisis itself. So I was lucky. Not all government ministers in Norway at that time knew English in those times, and they certainly hadn't learned it as a 10-year-old in Brooklyn. My life and upbringing had given me an exceptional opportunity, once more. Although it was really tough, I can tell you, with very little sleep and time for even eating. Over 9 days and nights, I managed. I also learned that I could cope even under tremendous pressure. But we were all lucky, not only I, and tremendously relieved as our efforts were crowned by success. 2 Americans, Red Adair and Boots Hansen, I still remember their names, experts from the Gulf of Mexico, succeeded in capping the blowout on the day 9. It was the day before May 1st, a major festive day in Norway, when all politicians of my party certainly were scheduled to speak across the country and inspire our troops and walk in the 1st of May marches. You can imagine how all of those people who were planning their speeches were trembling that day. What should we say? Well, there was a sigh of relief also across the country. Everyone had been gravely concerned about the potential environmental consequences and about our national pride and prestige. Meanwhile, I had been personally severely tested. In public, in Parliament, I had stood my ground, however, as opposition leaders had tried what they could to bring me down. So what did I do? I countered their criticism with facts and evidence, reminded them that there had been a broad consensus behind key conclusions about our oil policy, as well as our pollution security measures. So my reflection is this. In a crisis, yes, you have a big challenge, which can bring you down, but it can also give you a real chance to instead gain new and greater respect. So I was lucky again. In the early 80s, my first short term as Prime Minister in 1981, it was the end of a parliamentary period. So there was an election coming up. Now, and because of illness in the present Prime Minister, I took over at this strange point in time. Then I became opposition leader for 4 years. But during those years, as party leader as well, which I then had become, we pushed for a 40% rule of either sex being represented in any body that was elected by the party. Now, then, as I put together my second government in 1986, it made big international news. Norway had a female government, was the headline. Yes, a woman prime minister, and 8 women, 10 male ministers. My series of enormous challenges, however, having then created my second government with so many women, were not over. The Secretary General called me and asked me to do a major international challenge. Asked me to head a new independent commission to look at the many dangerous trends now facing humanity and the planet: population growth, environmental destruction, poverty, and lack of development. A huge agenda. The Secretary General said when I told him, look, I'm already more than fully occupied as opposition leader of my party. He said, don't forget, you are the only environment minister in the world to have become prime minister. And he was right. Always aware and convinced about the necessity of cross-sectoral and holistic approaches, and realizing I had no good alternative to propose to him, I stepped into a seemingly impossible task, or combined tasks. Again, I was challenged, but lucky. Again, I was criticized by the opposition for traveling internationally. I had to close my ears and go on. I had a chance to pick the best possible people for the commission, people from across the world. They were economists, biologists, political figures, as well as environmental and developmental experts. I was determined we must picture our real world not be dominated by the West and the North. We had a majority coming from developing countries, something new in the history of international initiatives. And not surprisingly, I was having a hard struggle to recruit women into that commission. I only partly succeeded on that. Again, in that work, it was facts and evidence-based approaches that worked. While building a team of people who trusted each other and saw a common purpose was essential. In the end, evidence is what made it possible to agree on a unanimous report. And I felt strongly, a report like this doesn't make a difference if you don't have really a unanimous analysis and unanimous recommendations from across the world. That's what we succeeded in doing. National interests did play a role in our discussions, but they were overcome. Religious affiliations was what was hardest to get around. But when we in the end concluded, even though you had these religious problems, Catholics, Muslims, protesting against these, in their view, radical proposals, we overcome also those. Because in the end, the convincing evidence prevailed. Women must have equal human rights to men. And that means they must have access to services to be able to plan their family and the spacing of their children. And you can imagine how religion entered into that kind of conclusions. Our report formulated the concept sustainable development, a pattern of development that takes care of the need of present generations without undermining the possibility for future generations to meet their own needs. Now, because there is no way to protect planet Earth unless we do it in a way that takes care of the rightful needs and aspirations of all peoples, not just those who happen to have grown up among the privileged few. Which is why it was environment and development. There is no way to take care of the environment without taking seriously the other part of the picture. I believe our common future has stood the test of time. It was based on extensive consultation and networks with NGOs, with governments, industry, and the scientific community across the world. In fact, more than a quarter century later, the key recommendations and messages of that report are still those that we need to pursue. The climate challenge, which we warned about so clearly back in 1987, is raising increasing concerns while the world still has not been able to reach the plan of action and commitment that is so urgently needed to safeguard the planet and the future of humanity. During the 90s, as my government followed up the recommendations of the report and prepared for Rio 1992, one example of what we did was the carbon tax on the Norwegian continental shelf. Well, this was radical. There was a national, but even more international outcry. How could my government even contemplate putting taxes on our own exporting industry? In Rio itself, all leaders from oil exporting countries insisted to see me, and what they want to tell me was how totally unacceptable such measures were. And my response was loud and clear. These are the kinds of policies that now need to be put in place, and not just in Norway, but across the world. You know what they even asked for? They wanted compensation because the value of their oil resources was being reduced because of the climate challenge. I mean, they turned the whole thing upside down. In 1996, after a total of 10 years as Prime Minister, over a period of 15 years, I had been 10 years Prime Minister, the rest opposition leader, I decided it was time to step down. Norway was doing well, we were facing my second consecutive national election, and a new party leader was ready to take charge. There was, however, no public call for change. I benefited from higher support in opinion polls than ever. It was a great surprise to all, in Norway and internationally, that I announced my resignation. So, ladies and gentlemen, I came as a surprise. I left as a surprise. It turned out that this decision made it possible to continue working on international issues, the way they had inspired me since I was a newly educated doctor. I had no plans in my, no specific plans in my mind. I was 57, but soon I was approached and asked to put my efforts into global health. As the election of the new Director General of the World Health Organization was coming up. Again, it was a new, an example of being confronted with a considerable new challenge. In '98, the plan and platform I prepared for taking over at the helm of WHO was one of renewal of innovation. We needed an improved evidence base, as well as increased credibility of the institution to be able to build alliances to private and public, to promote much more effective action at global level in global health. Above all, I knew we now needed to place health at the top of the political agenda. The poor health ministers, especially in developing countries, they were at the far end of the table, if they were even there. Because we had to reach the minds of finance ministers and prime ministers, because they must become health ministers themselves, responsible as they are for a comprehensive policy of serving the needs and rights of their people, inside and outside their own countries. Now, I want to underline, in my whole life, I have kind of absorbed and known that things are cross-sectoral. They are multidisciplinary. But I'll illustrate this point by telling you that once in so-called question time in Parliament, I remember ending up after an intense exchange with an opposition leader, me exclaiming as my last word, "Yes, all is indeed linked to everything else." At that time, nearly 20 years ago, this was immediately criticized by the journalists, by the opposition, as being evasive and unclear. Interestingly, however, today, this statement by me is often quoted with great respect, even with admiration. So the mindset, the way people have understood this reality of a broad, holistic, interdependent world has changed in the last 20 years dramatically. As a doctor and public health specialist, I learned to always look for the close and the far away, the small as well as the large, through a holistic lens. Ecology is a word that I learned at Harvard. My father, a doctor as well, had never heard about it when I returned and was telling him about ecology. But this is what it's all about. It relates to our minds as well as our bodies, the links between us as humans, to the communities and the societies we create, to our surroundings and the environment in which we live. Look at that. And community partnerships. Today, it also relates to planet Earth itself, as humanity faces fundamental challenges in our relationship with nature. We need to sense, to reflect, to analyze, fully cognizant of how interdependent we all have become in our own societies and across the globe. I realized early on how these key issues of development, economy, finance, environment, health, and education, could all only be dealt with on the basis of shared values and concerns, on human rights for both women and men, and on dignity for all. This is also the real basis for peace and security. Not only climate, but health illustrates the strongest story of globalization and the need for shared values, action to promote safety across the world. So I say, build and strengthen the evidence, which I hope many of you at Stanford are doing. Share the evidence and act upon the evidence. This is the only workable and realistic approach for effective action, given that we are obliged to pursue common responsibilities in a closely connected and interdependent world. Now, this is what happened in the tobacco campaign and the success of the first ever global convention in the public health field, which we concluded in 2003 as I left WHO. I had made my strong call in '98 in my acceptance speech. Tobacco should never be advertised, subsidized, or glamorized. That was the call, and in fact, the World Health Organization was able to agree on that convention 5 years later. It is also what happened in 2003, when the same spring that I left on my 5th year, as SARS, serious respiratory acute syndrome, spread across the world from China. And we issued travel recommendations and identified a new viral disease that was unknown, because we could mobilize global collaboration as WHO across every country and every scientific environment. And so in 4.5 months, it was abated, struck down, after an early and dramatic global spread, because we acted. It is what happened with our initiative to call together what I call the Commission on Macroeconomics and Health. It was led by Jeffrey Sachs, which clearly, he and his commission clearly demonstrated that health is an investment. Yes, of course, in our people, but it's an investment in the economy. And this is what people really didn't fully understand. They thought, let's get out of poverty, then we will get money enough to take care of people's health. No, invest in health and the economy will improve. So, in all of these examples, we were strengthening WHO, improving global health, and creating critical global public goods, while increasing national and international transparency and accountability. Some of you will remember that China tried to conceal SARS. It was really tough to get them above that. Faced with opportunities for renewal as well as risks, and still choosing to move the agenda forward, because there is always opposition if you want to make change. Even sometimes against considerable opposition, I think this is, daring to do that is a critical component of leadership. So that's one of the lessons I've learned. Determination, even courage, is of the essence. Vision without a plan, or a plan without action, is not much to admire. The only concrete obligation I took on after leaving WHO was to join the board of the United Nations Foundation. It's represented here in the front bench. I had been deeply inspired by Ted Turner and his amazing and exceptionally generous gift to the United Nations back in 1997, a year before I entered WHO. In WHO, we had worked with the United Nations Foundation as it started its ambitious agenda to promote the efficiency of UN institutions and helping build alliances, also with major private sector players, to better harness our combined ability in getting results. Bill and Melinda Gates and other key players in global health today were undoubtedly inspired by the wonderful example of Ted Turner. Without Gates, our innovative approach and the establishment of an institution called Gavi, an alliance to vaccinate children, or for that matter, the other success story in public health, the Global Fund against malaria, AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis would not have come about. We needed the help of the private sector and of people with a vision and willingness to put their money behind their thoughts. These last 10 years has also been one of, for me, I'm focusing on a number of the key issues that I have been engaged in through my life. As the Provost mentioned, Secretary General's envoy for climate change, and not against climate change, on climate change is the way it's called. Then, as member of his high-level panel on global sustainability, on the threats of nuclear weapons and proliferation, and my work as an elder. So that will be my last part of it, that on climate, the world has been much too slow to seriously respond to a clear and mounting evidence. The type of policy changes that are needed do enter into the core of our development patterns and our use of energy. Many countries are much too reluctant to commit to change, especially the largest emitters of greenhouse gases. And you know where we are. Simply put, development is not possible without energy, and sustainable development is not possible without sustainable energy. This is why the Secretary General has launched Sustainable Energy for All, to double the use of renewable energy, to double the rate of improvement in energy efficiency by 2030. This goal and many more goals require the building of partnerships, active involvement of the private sector. There is no solution without shared responsibility. No one can say this is not my problem. Good businesses do realize that they cannot succeed in societies that fail. So we are all in this together across the public and private sector of every country and across the globe. An important international debate is going on the post-2015 Millennium Goals. I now notice, and I really feel strongly about it, inequality has to be a key notion. It's already there at the heart of the process. People are aware that we cannot succeed unless we are able to overcome the increasing gaps between countries and inside countries in some cases. The danger of increasing disparities was addressed at the World Economic Forum in Davos last year. The leader of the IMF, Christine Lagarde from France, made a crucial point when she concluded, a more equal distribution of income allows more economic stability, more sustainable growth, and healthier societies. Clearly, when you listen to that, you all know policy choices are of the essence. This doesn't happen on its own. So to me, it's an optimistic sign that there are more people aware of the depth of truth in what Christine Lagarde just said. Today, I focus on climate, energy, conflict resolution with the elders. And so let me just say a few words about the elders. We early on said, globally, as we looked at the world, discrimination against women is a serious, continuous issue. As we then started delving in to that issue and asked ourselves, Where can we make a concrete difference? Where are things completely forgotten? We chose child marriage, an issue we as elders have felt we really need to bring to global attention. And in fact, it has helped. We have created a new alliance. We have announced at the Clinton Initiative in New York 2 years ago. It is now into the text being prepared for the post-2015. It's moving. And we have supported grassroots movements across the world to do something. Now, here to me, we see many things come together. Traditions that are unacceptable, unjust, and unhealthy are undermining the rights of young girls who have their life damaged long before maturity and independence. They are pulled out of school, their education stalled, their future undermined. It is a disgrace that these children have been pre-selected for diminished opportunity because of their gender, because they have been born into poor households and communities, or because of where they happen to live, which country. Finally, just a word on what Kofi Annan asked us to do. We are a small group of 11 now, elders, and they are all people whom I have admired and worked with previously in life in our different positions. Now we are all independent of any government, including your former president, Jimmy Carter, by the way. He's one of us. So Nelson Mandela asked us to offer our collective influence and experience to support peace building, help address major causes of human suffering, and promote the shared interest of humanity, end of quote. Well, you know, he gave us the calling. This group can speak freely and boldly, working both publicly and behind the scenes. Together, they will support courage where there is fear, foster agreement where there is conflict, and inspire hope where there is despair. Another end of quote. Well, as you can hear, it was a high calling indeed. One that humbles all of us, one that will once more, by the way, bring me to a week travel to Myanmar, already this month, later in March. As we seek to support as elders the democratic transition set in motion in this troubled country that has been under military dictatorship for decades, it is a calling that combines the values and inspiration of true global leadership, the calling that Mandela gave us. So thank you to all of you. I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you so much.
So my name is Tom Schnabelt. I serve as the Executive Director of the Haas Center for Public Service, and as I listened to Dr. Brundtland's talk and read our mission statement about inspiring Stanford to realize a more just and sustainable world through service, scholarship, and community partnerships, I could not think of a better person to give this talk. We have probably just time for one question. Who's the lucky person going to be? Why don't we...
Increase it to 2, otherwise.
Okay. Do I hear 3? No.
It means I spoke too long. That's what it means.
Rachel, we have a question up here in the front row.
Dr. Brundtland, first of all, thank you so much for such an inspiring talk. I have to admit that I share with you the pleasure of being a physician and an alumni of the Harvard School of Public Health. For everything else, hats off to you. But one question, though, you gave us an example of a woman that can do a lot for other women. Can you give us an example of other things that women can be the leaders of their own faith? And do you also believe that at times women have not played the best role in helping themselves reach equality?
Yeah, you know what? I will share with you one answer that I gave earlier today at the Haas Center about the same question. They were asking me about what global leaders had inspired me or that I admired, the ones I've met. And I said, one of them I mentioned was Margaret Thatcher. Although we have different political opinions, different parties, she was a determined political leader. And she was courageous. She had many other qualities that a leader has to have, whether a woman or a man. However, she disappointed me when I had a long discussion with her on a plane going from Tromsø in the north of Norway down to Oslo. I had a chance to speak with her about many things. And I said, how are you planning to increase the number of women in your government? She was kind of dumbfounded a little. I don't think she liked the question. She responded, you know, there are very few capable candidates. And I said, in my country, you can choose really anyone. So in England, there must be qualified women. Half of them are women. Secondly, I said, you must have women parliamentarians. Yes, but really, it's very hard to find anyone qualified. Now, you know, I realized that in her mind, she had been ambitious. She had done what was necessary for her to move from being a minister to becoming the prime minister, to fight for holding the position, but she didn't look at other women while she did it. It was a question of me, of, you know, what can I achieve? I always had this sense that I'm responsible to others, to other women, certainly. So as I told you, when I was asked to be a minister, and I had 4 children already, they were small, you know, could I do that? And I said, I have to do it, because what happens if women say no to challenges?
Thank you. The second question, I'm wondering, do we have a student that has a question? Let's split this between non-students and students. Any students have a question? This is your chance.
Oh, Mike, yeah.
You mentioned that funding public health could be a way to improve the economy, and I was wondering if you could give an example to back up that statement.
Yeah. You know, if you ruin the health of people, you ruin the most important capital any country has. So as we in the US and in Europe realized the drama in the 60s, that what people were puffing in was dangerous, cancerogen, you know, we gradually established laws and systems to cut down the use of tobacco. We had campaigns, but we also have legislation about advertisement, about, you know, but the rest of the world, the developing world, as we try to restrain the spread of this pollutive substance in our countries, the tobacco companies put their attention to other countries who didn't have the kind of political maturity or democracies to make laws, so they were flooding cigarettes across the world in countries where very few were smoking. So again, you have a global challenge that affects the health of people, and that affects the health of the economy. And so it's just one example. but there are so many within public health. You know, when we vaccinate children through the Gavi, or get much higher percentages of children vaccinated, we save millions of lives every year. And that benefits a number of countries and families across the world who then can choose to have fewer children because they see them growing up. So there are enormous amounts of such examples.
Thank you. So I just want to end the lecture by saying thank you again to Dr. Brundtland for a very inspiring talk. Thank you to Provost Etchemendy. I know there's a lot of questions that are unanswered right now, but we have the great fortune of having access and the availability of Dr. Brundtland for the next 8 weeks or so within the Haas Center. So if you are having that question that's burning and you really want to have it answered, we can actually connect you with her. She'll be staying with us at the Haas Center again for the next several weeks, or next 8 weeks or so. So can we please give another round of applause to Dr. Brundtland?